All right. Good morning, everyone. Just let me know if I'm not audible enough, or if I need to stop moving, then I'll do that. But my talk today is going to be about one of the case studies that we have been working on for the past 18 months now. And it is about how we actually took one of the major, I cannot name the client here, but of course, once I'm outside, we can talk about it, about how one of the major cruising industry clients, we took them from what they were doing earlier to a microservices-based framework and, what it means now. So a quick brief about myself. My name is Vikas. I am the group CTO with Monolith. We have been in business for the last almost 8 years, doing services and consulting and high-end consulting for clients, which ends up being a lot of Scala-driven ecosystem. It ends up being a lot of microservices. It ends up being a lot of digital transformation that we are carrying out. So this is where my time essentially goes during the day. And then as Monolith, we are partners with, of course, Lightbend, Databricks, and other organizations, as you see. So that's us. We are spread across 4 geographies. We are in Toronto, we are in Chicago, we are in Singapore, and we are in India, where a lot of engineering gets driven as well. So the agenda for the talk is mostly going to be driven around these 4 factors. What was the vision for this particular organization that really prompted them to embark on a digital journey? Then we'll talk about the story of transformation and some of the failures that we had on the way, and the tools and techniques that we used, and learnings, if I can call them learnings, or they're ongoing learnings right now. But feel free to stop me anywhere in between, and we can talk about anything that you have to talk. So the vision of this particular client that we are talking about was the fact that they had been in the cruising business, or they are in the cruising business for a long time. How many people have actually been on a cruise ship? Perfect. Okay, not many. And that is the general theme. 3% of the people in US, they have actually ever been on a cruise. So this is a market that they want to grow. And one of the factors or one of the avenues for growing this market is through digital transformation, and actually making sure that they are innovating on business quick enough, or fast enough, so that they can actually get innovative products to the market. Now, one of the things for them, of course, is that they would like to upsell or increase the revenues of any cruise that is undertaken. So you might want to take a cruise, or maybe you are taking a cruise, or maybe you're planning your next cruise. So all these points, they are actually upsell points for any organization to engage you. For let's not talk about the cruising industry, talk about any organization, it holds the same. But for them, since they are already in business for a long time, something like this is really going to help them if they can actually personalize your experience, your engagement on the basis of the cruise that you're taking right now, and your experience on the basis of what do you want to do next. If you really like a bar on a ship, what would you do next? So making predictions on top of that, and giving you offers, and giving you upsells. So that is how we got in, and of course this is how they would like to drive their revenues and whatnot. But of course just like any other legacy system which has been in existence for a long time, there is a lot of inertia present in the system. So it is a bulky system, difficult to change. There's a lot of static content on the ships, as a result of which they cannot just go and announce that, okay, this is what the next 15-day plan is. They are doing planning and events on a day-to-day basis, which does not gel well with a lot of cruising guests. The multilingual support is lacking, and the pre and post cruises, they are not optimized for upsell. And given the fact that they are still on legacy platforms, a lot of innovation is bypassing them. So they are not really taking care of the latest innovations or the trends in the market, because they're not geared for that. Think about it. This is a system which is primarily driven by mainframes. This is a system which does a lot of booking payments on the mainframes and so on. So of course zero personalization and micro segmentation, so personalization does not exist at all. So how did we approach this problem? Now, a lot of this is going to be, the slides which were actually shown to the, the CIOs and CEOs, and this is how we are going to do it. But a pre-cruise analysis, finally getting onto, you know, like booking, from pre-boarding to the guest being on the cruise, to actually getting, you know, like the post-cruise analysis and setting up the guest to be a repeat guest, or, you know, like doing another cruise for this particular guest. So also, one of the key consideration is that any technology that we are going to put into place, that needs to be omni-channel, you know, right from your mobile devices to your tablets to your kiosks to everything that you interface today with. Everything should be, you know, like exposed and engaged to you so that you can actually work along with the client. So the steps, of course, you know, like in theory they are simple. You know, like you do a curation, you understand, you know, like what the guest profile is. You do an analysis by tracking the events, tracking all the events that the guest is doing on the ship. You know, like right from your check-ins to a bar to your how do you actually go ahead and you know, like pay for your drinks, or, you know, like what are the shows on the cruise that you're interested in, and so on. So all of those are events. So tracking those events and then presenting recommendations on the basis of that. So theory-wise, you know, like that's what we do. For any system that we get into, that's what you do. You collect data, you analyze that data, and then you act on that data. But, you know, like it's easy to say, but we'll get to see, you know, like how we actually did that. So the theory that we propose is that, okay, we are going to build reactive microservices for you, which are really going to help you evolve and really going to innovate, help you innovate and bring latest and greatest products into the market. But the fun part is that, you know, like that sounds great. How do you do it? And that is where the rubber hits the road. Now, for us, this was a big challenge. Huge system. Where do you start? So we had a few points to consider. That, you know, like, okay, it's a huge domain. Where do we start? How do we do it? You know, like, why are we doing it in the first place? Of course, that part was clearer. And you know, like, what do we take? Which part of the system do we take? And who are the people who are going to get involved? And I'm sure, you know, like a lot of you who interface with clients, you know that they want it yesterday. So, you know, like that is the case with us. So everything needs to happen yesterday. Okay, so that's where we said that, okay, you know, like let's begin the journey. But the journey, of course, as you know, everything looks great on the PPTs, but actually it is not. So once you're off the slide deck, things really start getting dark. And that is what is going to happen for us for some time. So let's see, how did we start? So we looked at the monolith. Now the monolith is currently in production. People are cruising, the monolith is serving them, it is in production, payments are getting done, you know, like bookings are getting done, guests are getting added, everything is happening. So it's a car doing 100 miles an hour. Now, the business, of course, needs zero disruption or very less disruption, if at all. And we did not have any leeway to make changes to the database because, you know, like the system is running. And the approach should reduce the risk of evolution. So that is one of the parameters. Now, standard way of, how many of you are actually working with some monoliths and trying to convert that into microservices? Great. Okay. More than people who are cruising, which is nice. Okay. So the standard way of doing it is the following, that you identify the modules, you know, like say that, okay, these are the ones that I'm going to split. You identify the tables that, okay, you know, like this one talks to these tables, I can split them out, I can, you know, like wrap them around in a service. And then you know, like update the code for your monolith to start talking to the microservice, and then you keep repeating that. So that is the standard paradigm which is followed. Now, but this is just a single module. And what I'm showing you is 10% of that single module. So one of the modules, so the first module that we picked, because we were planning to get into personalization for a guest, was the guest module. That, okay, let us talk about the guest first. And this is just 10% of, you know, like what the guest does. So given the fact that all of this needs to be done just for the guest, okay, let us start doing that. So we split the guest module into, you know, like major sections, saying that, okay, these ones could be the subdomains that we are going to talk about. And since these are the subdomains, let us pick up the ones which are, you know, like going to help us and which are easily decomposable. So let us decompose. Now, again, in theory, this is how you do it. You identify the submodules, you understand the database tables that these submodules are talking to, and you understand the data that each of them is controlling. And then what you do next is that you simply pull out one of them. Say, for example, you pull out identity, you put it into its own, the data for identity is put into its own database, and then you like expose an API here. The monolith or like the other subdomains, they start talking to your newly created submodule, and then you rinse and repeat. So then you pull out the next one, then you pull out the next one, and then you pull out the next one. So that is how essentially you keep going through the process. However, for those of you who said that they are working with monoliths, how many times do you think something like this actually works? None. Great. So yes, you are absolutely right. And we failed. So we tried to do that, and this is just a single module that we are talking about. Like guest module is just a single module that we're talking about. Didn't really work that way. Okay, so we tried another approach that, okay, this is not going to work. Let us try to do something else. What is that something else? So rarely, if at all, monoliths are going to lend themselves easily to be decomposed. That's never going to happen, almost never. Well, you are very lucky if something like that happens. The relationships can be very normalized. Like understanding the monolithic code and connecting the wires is a challenge. Well, let's forget about monolithic. Like code written by not you, but by anybody else is a challenge. So we always see that okay, this is not done by me, and I would have done it in a different way. So and the fact that like we cannot just migrate by a click of a button. There are a lot of ugly migration steps, and we also try to identify what are the modules that really don't need to be migrated right away, because if you try to migrate anything and everything and it is not leading to help in personalization, then it is not like helping or create business value. So okay, so we decided, okay, let's reattempt it. This time we followed a different approach in order to reattempt, and the approach was that since the monoliths are highly coupled and there is going to be a high amount of coordination between different pieces, we first need like all our technology around it, which are all our best practices around the monolith, so that we can try to decompose that. And of course, we cannot do a big bang. That just happens in theory. So it has to be something that works in smaller iterations. You have to eat away the monolith in smaller iterations, and that is the approach that we took. But how do we eat it away? So let's start again. So we have the guest account, we have the database to which this guest account is talking. Now, the first thing that we did, because we already identified, and this is where the organizational structure comes in. So the first thing that we identified is that they have got different teams. Like there is a UI team, there is a backend team, there is a QA team, and so on. And people on UI, they are really, really proficient on UI. These are the people who understand, like Node, Angular, React, and like they understand the newer paradigms. And then there is a backend team. So the first thing that we did was to split the UI from the account. So we have the guest account. Now the UI does not, like bundle along with the monolith anymore. So we split that out. So once you split the UI piece out, what happens is that, okay, since the organization structures were built that way, so we could get a UI piece which is, like split out. Now this UI piece was then, like talking to whatever services that it was calling within the guest monolith, right? Through an API which was wrapped over the monolith. Again, not easy to do, but whatever endpoints that the UI is talking to. So the monolith is huge. It talks to the database, it talks to third-party systems, it talks to the UI. So whatever was the monolith's UI interaction part, those were wrapped into like services and exposed. Now, step 2 was, okay, now we have done this part. So the UI sits separately. It can be deployed separately. There's a separate team which can take care of that. But now let us try to like pull out another service from that. So something that really, really helps you in this scenario is domain-driven design. And I know that a lot of us hear that, okay, let us, yeah, we should know domain-driven design, but a lot of people, they don't actually get there. But this is something that really, really helps you in order to build systems which are going to be, like structured in the right way and lend themselves easily to microservices. So we identified the, the bounded context, and we also identified which parts of the system have got high churn, because these high churn parts of the system are the ones that we can pull out and put it into a module of its own. So once that was identified, and what parts are relatively disjoint, then you start understanding, or you start doing event storming around that as to, for this particular piece of, or this particular logical block of code that we're talking about, what are the events that this generates for other systems, and what are the events that it consumes from other systems. So once you have that understanding, that allows you to break out a part of a system which is like high churn, which has got a lot of interactions going on, and like which is relatively disjoint. So for example, in our case, we understood that something like promotions, which we run on the basis of like your profile, your demographic, your cruising history, and all of that. And this is something that changes a lot, like from one week to the other, depending on like how the ship booking is doing. You want to like change the promotions. I'm sure like Alejandro, depending upon like how people were actually booking tickets for this event, like the promotions were changing. So that is how you have to be dynamic in that. So we pulled out promotions. Now again, introducing a new service, just like our earlier scenario, it's easy. You can pull it out. But some of the things that you have to keep in mind is that when you actually pull out a submodule out of a monolith, then in that case you have to be very cautious about who's talking to whom, right? You cannot have the microservice or the so-called new module talk back to the monolith, So it can be the other way around, because if you are introducing those dependencies, then that is going to be like chaotic. And then in any case, you would be making changes to the monolith a lot, and like it is not going to work out. So that is how we pulled it out. And now what do you do as a next step? Like your monolith is already in production, it is just running. You have a module pulled out, you have a module like ready, but what do you do? How do you test it? How do you actually make sure that you can actually change the tires of a car doing 100 miles? So what you have to do, or like what we did, was that we started sending it some shadow traffic. What does a shadow traffic mean? A shadow traffic means that like the UI not only sends the traffic to your main module, which is your monolith, but it also starts talking to your new module. So here, whatever UI calls are coming in, they not only go to the monolith, but they also start talking to the like the promotions submodule, or like the microservice that we have created. So essentially what is going to happen is that this is going to get data, this is going to get data as well. Yes, it is repetition of data. However, that is one of the things that you'll have to do when the system is running in production. If we had the leverage that like no matter what, we could just change it, and we could just like stop the world for a day, or like a few weeks and change it, absolutely we would have done it that way. But seldom does that happen. So you start sending shadow data to this one, and then you actually do an analysis to check that the data for the monolith and the data for the new microservice, are they equitable? Of course, they are not going to be exactly the same, because you are like building it as a microservice now as compared to the monolith. But this is where the check comes in, and you try to see that like with an event which the user was creating, say for example like he was reacting back to a promotion that was sent. How was the monolith reacting to that, and how is the microservice reacting to that? So once you have that clarity, and that like from a data level they look great, then in that case that's a check for you. This could be a manual check, or this could be some tool that you're using. So for us, we actually developed a tool called Liquibase that we like use internally, which understands the domain of the monolith, and it understands like how we are building the microservice, and does a check between the two. So once we have this clarity that well, this seems to be working. So if you notice, nothing has changed from a client perspective, nothing has changed from the business perspective, nothing has changed from the development team's perspective, apart from the fact that there is an extra load in the system now for like generating, accepting this data, and working with that data. Okay, next what you do is that once you understand that like things look great because we have the check sign here, let us start the traffic to flow from flow to the new service. And for this, the recommended thing is to use something called a service mesh. So you could be using Istio, you could be using Console, you could be using if Apigee gives you some plugin to do that. But this is where it really becomes interesting. So what a service mesh or a gateway is going to do is that it is going to allow you to write your rules, which will allow you to either send the traffic to the monolith, or send traffic to the microservice, or do both, right? So for what we did was that once the new service was put into traffic, we needed to control the traffic, because if it is put into traffic and something fails, then in that case you have to revert back. But in this case, since we have the gateway in front of our services, it just allows you to either do A or B or A-B both. So this is what the traffic controller allowed to do. And for our case, we did run the duplicated data, or like the microservice as well as the monolith working in parallel for a few weeks before we said that, okay, like this approach is going to work. Because think about it, that first system that you're going to put, like scratching it out from the monolith, right? So we are strangling the monolith, and we are putting a new system in place. It goes through its own life cycle. It has got its own, QA test done. It has got its own deployment strategy. It has got its own containers. And that is how you actually, test it. So if something is not working, you are easily switching it back. So again, one more thing which we did was that we only implemented this functionality for certain cohorts. So not all the geographies, they were affected by this, only a certain amount of geographies. And this is something that all the systems which are in production, they do a lot. So these are called canary releases, in which you just release it on one part of the ecosystem. And then on the basis of that, you try to understand how well it is doing. And taking that feedback, then you roll it to the other parts. So once you have that part done, so essentially then after that what you do is that you ask the gateway to send the monolith specific request to the guest account and the microservice specific request to the microservice, and then you cut the cord between the two. Now in our case, we had to, so you have the options now that the data which was kind of present in both the databases, you can kill out one of them, or let it stay there. For compliance purposes, for us, we just had to let it be there, and this was then now getting updated with new data sets and whatnot. So this is an approach that worked for us in terms of pulling out or strangling the monolith which was already in place and gradually into pieces. So again, this is still huge. This is huge. I'll show you a ecosystem further down in the slides which shows how big this is. But this is an approach that worked for us. Now, one thing, as I told you, you have to be sure about is that your monolith talks to the microservice and not the other way around. And this is something that so now for any interaction for promotions, the monolith knows that, okay, it has to talk to the promotions microservice and take it from there. So similar thing then was done for loyalty, then was done for identity, then was done for personalization, and so on. So that is how the entire ecosystem was built. Any questions so far? Are you with me? Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is let's say the monolith as well is evolving. The business needs are changing. We need to update it.
Right.
And also, you're building Microsoft. How do you?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. And as you would expect, there's no straight answer for that. So what we definitely want to avoid is that you want to avoid putting more into the monolith. So what you have to do is that if it is changing, and that is where the first point came in, that you have to identify the subdomains of the system which are churning more. And that is something that you pluck out first. So if you are doing that exercise relatively well, then yeah, that tendency reduces. But again, there's nothing to say that it is not going to happen, because the business still wants to run the multi-billion-dollar business, and they're not going to stop for you to change the ecosystem. So what we tried to do was to avoid making any changes to the monolith. And as soon as we knew that, okay, there are 5 changes which are coming to this particular module, that was the module which became a higher priority module for us to pluck out. Yes. Sorry, I'll come back. Yeah.
You showed a kind of cord between the 2 databases, keeping them in sync.
Right.
What was that cord in practice?
So the cord initially for keeping the 2 databases in sync was to seed your microservice with the data which is coming from the monolith, because the microservice by itself does not have any data. So all the promotions, say for example, which have to be run for this month, once you pull out the microservice, it does not have any information about that. So it is required to seed that, and for our liquid base to actually compare the two. So that is what we were using it for. Thanks.
Yeah, precisely the transition from step 3.1, I think, prior to this, step 4, and that's when you introduce the service mesh. I wonder what challenges you encounter when you actually, you sort of imply that you have lifted all the backend functionality required for your promotions microservice into the promotions backend, right?
Right.
Or service layer. What kind of challenges do you encounter, and how do you actually proceed with that? I see that you're routing now in step 4, you start routing traffic directly from the UI to the promotion microservice. While in 3.1, the monolith backend was still with.
Yeah, so so the gateway or the service mesh. So this is more like you are writing code. So we were putting code into the monoliths API to say that okay, do this as well as do that, right? What the service gateway allows you to do, and again this was a learning that we could have introduced service gateway earlier. The service gateway allows you to manage this. So tools like console. So we used console, in this case, or Istio, or any similar service mesh. That will not only allow you to do things like routing. That will also allow you to say that okay, I've got a switch now. Do I want the flow to go to A? So it's more like A/B testing. But you are saying that okay, go to A, go to B, or go to both A and B. So the challenge for us was that of course this is a strategy that worked for us, and Shadow worked fine. But now we wanted something which we could bring to all the other microservices that we are doing, and that is where the service mesh was introduced. Right. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry, I got parts of it, but are you asking that, did we come across a scenario where the microservice had to talk back to the monolith?
No. So when you build your microservice, you realize that there's a bug in your monolith.
Oh.
That data validation is not easy to do, or?
Oh yeah, so yeah, that particular data validation is it is tough. So the first time when you're doing it, there could be bugs in the microservice, there could be bugs in the monolith, there could be data mismatches which result just because of the fact that okay, the microservice is built according to the needs of today versus the monolith is. So yes, so the liquid base that I'm talking about, that is based on feature files driven a program which hopefully we are going to open source. But the idea there is that the business understands that okay, for the monolith, this is what was working, and this is how the promotions were getting handled, and they were getting evaluated. And for the new business needs, this is how it is happening. But when the data flows from the earlier pipeline versus the new pipeline, these are the differences, and those differences were built into the liquid base configuration. So for comparing the two, but none of this is easy. Of course, So all of this looks pretty on the picture here, but none of this is easy. It takes a lot of effort to actually get it done, and still it is not clean. So just like you suggested that, does the monolith stop evolving? No, it does not. Even though we want it to happen that way, but yeah. All right, I'll just move ahead. Some of the, okay, now let's talk about some of the tools and technologies that we used for something like this. Now, one of the things, and again, this is going back to the books, much ignored, but very helpful. So we got a lot of inspiration from working with legacy code by Michael Feathers, because that actually tells you how to really, and this is not something which changes when you're just, doing microservices, or it is 10 years old book, so it is not applicable anymore. Absolutely, it is amazing. So a lot of practices that we actually built in terms of, finding the high churn parts of the system and whatnot, they actually came from working effectively with legacy code. And one of the things that we have to be very sure about before we embark on a migration journey is that you should have a very good test harness around your old system. Again, this is something which is left open, that we know how it works, but no, that does not work that way. So one of the things that we always did was that we first, if the monoliths piece that we were trying to target did not have enough test coverage around it, so there was enough test harness built around that before we actually jumped into it. So those are some of the hygiene factors which are very helpful. And again, JUnit and Arquillian were used for that. Another book which is going to be very, very helpful is domain-driven design. Of course, if you can read Eric Evans, great. Otherwise, there are simpler books. So we got a lot of reference from domain-driven design distilled, as well as how to implement that. And so one of the technologies that we are using for this is Legom. How many people know Legom? Okay. Great. So there are a lot of parallels. Like Legom is a framework, is a microservices framework that allows you to write microservices along with guardrails, as I call it. It is opinionated, but yeah, it just maps directly to a lot of like findings from domain-driven design. Another thing which was helpful for us was understanding, like the art of scalability, which is how do you actually build a scale cube, and how do you actually split up your monolith into microservices across 3 dimensions. So either you are actually, like splitting it into functional decomposition, which is what we were doing by functionally, like pulling out pieces. Then you like understand, okay, how important is this piece? Now the promotions piece that gets a lot of attention during certain times of the year, say for example around any major events, Christmas, or like holidays, or kids' vacations. So at that time, how do you want to like scale it horizontally and vertically? So that is what this allows you. And the data partitioning comes with the fact that you are actually splitting your monolith into microservices, each with their own data sets. So all these factors come into play when you're actually trying to do a decomposition. Then, of course, as you would expect, a lot of our inherent culture and philosophy has been driven by the fact that everything needs to be reactive. So we try to abide by the reactive manifesto, like to the core, wherein like every service that needs to be fault tolerant, it needs to be scalable, it needs to be elastic. So all those paradigms and parameters are taken into account. The good thing is that when you use something like Legom, or when you use like the Lightbend stack, or when you use Scala, like a lot of things they are so Scala pushes you in the direction of best practices. So does Legom. So Legom already like pushes you in best practices of event sourcing, CQRS, like the circuit breakers are right there, so you're not building your own circuit breakers. So like a lot of things, they just get imparted to you. But something that you have to keep in mind is that the microservices, how do they talk to each other? Like it's easy to build a microservice and still fall into the traps of synchronous communication, and still like be held hostage to like thread locking and whatnot. But what do you do? Like, do you do ACID or do you not do ACID? So some of those things are defined by the reactive paradigm. We'll get into a little more detail, but those are the things that helped us. In terms of the tech stack, as you would see, I've tried to like put down some things here. So we used Apigee as our API gateway, backed by Console, which is like the service mesh, which allows us to do the gating. Then for all the external integrations for the monolith, we used Apache Camel. Legom is used for most of our like microservices built both in Java as well as Scala. Then like Cassandra, Couchbase, like then the general usual suspects in terms of deploying it on containers. So we are deploying it on DCOS as the main platform, and yeah, like so this is the reactive stack, and we follow pretty much the reactive stack along with Legom, working with Java and Scala. This is how like the entire ecosystem is split across various technologies, and like what do we use where. So as you would see that for DCOS we were doing a lot of work along with Marathon, but we are moving it across to Kubernetes now. So that is how the ecosystem looks like for us. Key components, as I talked about, Legom, very opinionated, built on top of Akka and Play. It helps build systems which are reactive, and it gives us support for a lot of things out of the box. So if you're thinking about, hey, like I should have used, I hear about event sourcing a lot, but I don't know how to do it, just use Legom. Like that gives you event sourcing structures out of the box. Of course, you are free not to use it, but yeah, like if you use it, you are building a better system. Differentiating between event sourcing and CQRS, you could build your like different pipelines and so on. And then like circuit breakers and other goodies are included. Console, as I said, service discovery, segmentation. That is what we use it for spreading across the traffic. Then we used Apache Spark a lot for all our data processing and batch processing and building models for predictions and all of that. So that gets heavily used. DCOS, as I said, that is the main infrastructure on which we do our deployments. It is distributed by default. It provides you with a cluster of machines that you can like view as a single machine and do your deployments. And like it allows you to help with scale and monitoring as well. We use a lot of Kafka. for inter-process communication between the microservices. An interesting thing which happens with ships is the fact that you have, all of us know about data centers, right? Like either you have on-prem or in the cloud. Well, the funny thing is that on the ship, a data center is in motion as well. So when the ship is actually moving, like your data is moving along with the ship. And how do you actually synchronize something which is done on the shore along with the ship? So this is called the ship-shore integration that we did along with Kafka Connect. Then, of course, like something which came in very handy was Launch Darkly. Launch Darkly, I don't know if people are familiar about feature flags with Java. But it's similar. It allows you to do A/B testing, and like allows you to do canary release it to a particular part of the geography and not everybody. So that helped, and like Jenkins and Epicurio. So yeah, this is how the system looks like now. I know it's scary, and if you can read it, great, because I can't. But the funny thing is that like these are all the microservices which are now interacting with each other based on ECOS. A lot of like interaction and like going on with the external systems, third-party systems, and whatnot. But this is what the guest module looks like right now, given the fact that even now it is more than 70% converted. But you can just imagine how huge the ecosystem is, and we are just talking about a single module right now. So let's lighten up a little. Like as I said, as they say, October 17th is not far away. But this is the journey ahead. So right from going from discover, how do you discover cruises and how do you like work with them, to booking, to like actually your commerce part, to check in, to embarking, cruising, debarking, and like creating memories and staying connected. So this is the digital transformation journey that we are going through right now, and hopefully someday we are going to get there. As of today, this is what it is. The guest module has been rolled out to 60% of the ships, and the data centers, they are kept in sync, and this is how people feel about it. According to the survey which was done just last month, 89% of the customers, they feel that now like the ship or the company is more engaging as compared to what it was like 5 years back. The business is satisfied because now they can roll out new products easily, at least on the guest side of the system, which is personalization, which is the first area that we attacked. And so things are generally good. Now, the key learnings, I know I've got 5 minutes, but this is probably going to be important. Most of the systems, they begin with a monolith first approach. And if you're building a product, if you're building a system and you think that, okay, I can just build it out into detailed microservices in the beginning, that's not going to happen. Or at least, like that is what history says. So rather, like you might want to start with a monolith first approach and then carve out pieces which are going to be, like high churn, or which are lending themselves to be microservices. So all the like large enterprises, they started like that. The team working on microservices, this is our learning, that they should be very conversant with domain-driven design. The team should understand the reactive architecture. The focus should be on base. Like base is more like making data eventually consistent. It is not ACID. None of eBays or Amazons of the world actually do ACID anymore. Like they cannot. That's not going to scale. Then there are going to be, you have to understand that since you're working on base, data might not get consistent, and then you have to get into like compensating patterns. And then, to your question, like stop digging, do not add any new functionality to monolith. Does not always happen, but yeah, that's the way to go. An easy start, according to us, is splitting the front end and the back end, and that goes a long way. Keep the communication asynchronous, follow the Scala cube. Testing, containerizing, deployment of microservices, so all the infrastructure needs, they need to be handled well enough. So your CI/CD pipelines need to be laid out, your like test scenarios of whether you're going to use Hoverfly for your APIs or whatnot, those need to be understood. Feature flags and dark launches are going to be your friends in production launches. And like monitoring is going to be very important. So we use Prometheus and open tracing for that, and that helps us go a long way. And the biggest thing, of course, is that the organizational constraints or the considerations. So what you need is small service teams that own aspects of, so we just work with a promotions team to start with that. Okay, like what do you do? We just need to sit with you and understand you. So again, the teams do require, like multidisciplinary units, which include, like cross-functional teams. And the idea is to, of course, like eventually embrace software craftsmanship and code ownership. So I think that is pretty much what I had. Any questions?